Hello, welcome back to my channel. My name is Julie. Tonight we're going to pick up where we left off in our book read, The Way of the Warrior. I read a good chunk of chapter 1 last night. The video was about 45 minutes long. I couldn't stop reading. I was just, I couldn't stop. It was one of those books where I just couldn't, it's a book that I just can't seem to put down. So we're going to pick up with where we left off last night. We're almost finished with chapter 1, and tonight we're going to start going into chapter 2 as well. Actually, in this book, they're not called chapters, they're called codes. So we're almost done with code 1, and we're fixing to go into code 2. So let me start where I left off last night. If you watched the video, the first video of our book read, we left off where he was talking about when he was in the hospital and he was in a lot of pain. And he refused the nurse's painkillers because he wanted to feel the pain. He wanted to, if I could bear the pain, I could bear whatever pain was ahead of me. So reluctantly, the nurse and my wife helped me out of bed. So you can just, you see here that if he can bear this pain, he can bear whatever pain comes ahead. So where we left off, it starts, so many of us see pain as the boundary of our limitations. When we experience pain, that's when we choose to stop. We have confused knowing peace with becoming prisoners. The way of peace is not without pain. The way of peace comes only by walking through the pain. I'll never forget walking out of that room with a catheter attached to my body and walking for a few minutes down the hallway until what once felt unbearable was now just a part of who I was. 3 hours later, I made myself get up again and walk further than I had before. By 8 o'clock in the morning, when I noticed that there was a nurse shift change, I got myself out of bed, grabbed my clothes, went and took a shower, and dressed myself to leave. By the time my wife returned from taking a small break, I was dressed and ready to go. It took a lot of negotiating to get released from the hospital, since the nurses' minds I was still a patient. In the nurses' minds, I was still a patient, but I would not be their prisoner. I had to walk through my pain, and I was ready to walk free. Some time had passed since I walked out of those doors, and frankly, when I write about having cancer, it feels as if I'm talking about somebody else's life. Since that time, I have met so many people who have gone through similar challenges far worse than my own. And since my battle with cancer, I have had an endless number of battles of different kinds. The one thing remains true. Right behind the battle that has just been fought, another battle lies in wait. For every war that you've bled for and won, there is another war waiting to overtake you. There is no path in this life where you can escape those things that will war against your peace. Even Jesus, the Prince of Peace, knew that his path would lead him to agony and suffering. Even for Jesus, there was no escape from the war that rages within the human spirit. Yet in the most violent moment of his life, when he carried the sins of the world upon himself on the cross amidst brutality, he made the way for us to know peace. This is the way of the warrior. Not that we run from our suffering, not that we shrink back from the sacrifices demanded of us, but that in the midst of it, regardless of what rages around us, we are at peace. Jesus said there would always be wars and rumors of war. History has sadly proven him right. All around us wars rage, nation against nation, tribe against tribe, people against people, brother against brother. Human history is like a fire out of control. It seems that violence will always rage and that peace will always elude us. Yet Jesus was equally convinced that he knew the way to peace and that peace would in the end stand as victory. For wars to end, there would have to be the end of violence. For violence to cease, there would have to be the end of hatred and greed. For hatred and greed to breathe their final breaths, forgiveness and generosity would have to take their places. When there is peace, there is no fear. Where there is fear, there is no peace. So then the journey for peace begins within our hearts. This is why we must face our fears, stand in our pain, and walk courageously into the uncertainty and mystery of a better future. It may seem like a small thing, but when you get up in the morning and face your fears, you are participating in the redemption of the universe. When you refuse to allow yourself to be paralyzed by the uncertainty of tomorrow and set forth with courage and faith, you become part of creating a new world, a better world. That peace, the peace that your soul longs for, is the very peace the world needs. I cannot speak of peace and not speak of Jesus, for it is Jesus alone who leads us to the way of peace. The way of Jesus is the way of the warrior. It is Jesus who is the warrior of peace. There are not different kinds of peace, just different contexts where peace can be realized. When you have won the battle for inner peace, you now carry within you what the world desperately needs. It is only when you have inner peace that you can bring peace to a world at war with itself. The warrior fights for peace. And that was the end of the first chapter. So code 2 is titled The Warrior Seeks to Become Invisible. This ought to be interesting. The warrior does not need to be seen. They are most powerful when they are invisible. It is impossible to blah 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 blah. I can't read. It is impossible to defeat an enemy you cannot see or disarm, a warrior whose weapon never seems to strike. The warrior knows that lesser opponents depend on swords and bows and arrows, but the weapon of the warrior is their wisdom. Wisdom is hard to define, but easy to identify. It cannot be purchased or easily gained. You may overpower an enemy and yet still die a fool. While there are many expressions of wisdom for our purposes, it will be defined as the ability to bring peace. When the warrior is wise, they fight only for peace. The proof of their victory is that they have created a world where what is good and beautiful and true prevails. The fool is the enemy of wisdom. The fool is driven by greed and power and violence. The fool uses their weapons to harm, injure, and destroy. The warrior wields a weapon only to defend, protect, and liberate. The warrior does not wield a weapon. They are a weapon. Their strength does not come from the weapon they hold, but from the wisdom that has taken hold of them. The novice believes that their power lies in being seen. The warrior understands they are most powerful when they are unseen. The way of the warrior is not a path toward a war, but path towards wisdom. The warrior knows that they have not learned anything, but that they know everything they need to learn. Wisdom is the warrior's greatest weapon. When you have wisdom, you are never unarmed, you are never defenseless, and you are never powerless. You need skill to know how to shoot an arrow straight, but only wisdom can teach you how to never need to shoot it. Wisdom is not the result of having learned enough. It comes when you know there is never enough learning. Wisdom is less like a deep ocean and more like the force of a river. The power of the river is in its ability to adapt to its environment, change its course when necessary, and yet always find its way towards its destiny. The river reminds us that it's not always the straight path that leads us to where we must go. The meandering of a river might cause you to think it has lost its intention, yet the river, as wide as it may bend and as often as it may change its course, always moves forward towards its intended destination. The warrior is like a river, with fluid and adaptive moves. The warrior is not rigid or unchanging. The warrior is not like a stone that cannot be broken, but like water that even when cut into two cannot be divided. It is not a weapon that makes you a warrior, it is your wisdom. My grandfather was a man who could be described as both a person of small stature and a man of great weight. I imagine this is the way they describe Napoleon. He was one of those unusual people who, though he never grew tall, taller than 5'5", had a presence that filled the room whenever he entered. It's hard to explain presence, but easy to identify it. There are some people who seem to do nothing to garner our attention, and yet the room tilts in their direction whenever they enter. A man by the name of Hermenindo di Cardona was accustomed to carrying the weight of power and influence. In a nation where the poor get poorer and the rich get richer, he defied the odds and rose above the status of his birth, using his intellectual prowess to become a high-level government official in the nation of El Salvador. I will be forever indebted to him for shaping who I am. He taught me how to play chess when I was 3 years old, pulled out maps and explained to me continental drift when I was 5, and taught me about global economics before I was 10. One of the curious things about my grandfather was the way he would both stand and move when he was in a room. I remember he once told me to never lean against a wall because it was a sign of weakness, but to always stand straight. I also remember when he was nearing 100 years old how he refused to let me help him up and down the stairs, insisting that he must do it for himself. One of the funny things about my grandfather is that he always found it entertaining to move so silently that no one would realize he had entered the room. He loved being able to walk into a room seemingly invisible to everyone who was there, and just stand there in his silence until someone realized he had been there all along. My grandfather taught me the power of being invisible, of not drawing too much attention to oneself, of conserving movement and cutting through sound. The warrior understands that their greatest power is in what is not seen. Long before the warrior is seen or heard, they must be felt. The greatest of warriors wins battles without their opponent ever knowing a war had been waged. Although others may see your skill with a bow or your expertise with a sword, you must never forget that your greatest weapon is wisdom. Years ago, I endeavored to describe the essence of wisdom in my book, Uprising. An essential component of wisdom is the ability to get to the core. Wisdom always finds a way through the mess we make of life. It doesn't find the easiest way, but the way marked by the footprints of God. Wisdom knows that the ancient paths will lead us into a divine future. Wisdom is the product of a sacred imagination. Wisdom knows the way to freedom. Where there is wisdom, there is always hope. Wisdom simplifies. Wisdom clarifies. Wisdom untangles. Wisdom unshackles. Wisdom illuminates. Wisdom liberates. In the end, wisdom enlightens us to live lives of nobility. This is the highest expression of wisdom, to live our lives for others rather than ourselves. The fool lives to consume all they can take from the world. The wise live to create a better world. The way of the warrior is to choose the path of nobility. The warrior also understands that wisdom is gained not in a moment, but in an endless number of moments in which choices must be made. The path toward wisdom is not taken by steps, but by choices. When you choose to take, you choose the path of the fool. When you choose to give, you choose the way of the wise. The warrior never fights out of anger. They fight only out of honor. They never fight to conquer. They fight only to liberate. The warrior fights against evil so that good may prevail. Wisdom is revealed by what a person fights for. If you fight for yourself, you have given yourself to too small a thing. The warrior fights against injustice, against poverty, against despair, against depression. The wisdom of the warrior establishes both their enemies and their battles. Only the fool fights battles not worth fighting or even worth winning. Because of their wisdom, the warrior does not engage in battles that should not be fought. And at the same time, they do not shrink back from battles that must be fought. This is true wisdom of the warrior. The warrior can win the battles where even the strongest have known only defeat. This is why the warrior is never powerless. You can try to take all their earthly weapons, but you cannot take their wisdom. And because the warrior has learned the way of wisdom, they are never powerless. I think I'm going to stop there for now. We're going to pick up, and it's going to talk about invisible leadership when we start with our next video. I don't want to keep these videos too long, so we're just going to read it in little bits at a time. So I hope you're enjoying this. I hope it's making you think. I hope it's doing something to your soul. When I picked this book out in the library, or in the bookstore, Barnes & Noble, it was at a time where my grief was so bad. And it was one of those low days that I was having. And I was also experiencing severe autistic burnout, which is getting better a little bit at a time. But at the time I bought this book, I was in a deep, dark valley. And when I saw the title of this book, I was like, I need this book. I need this book. I need to be a warrior. I don't want to be a complainer. I don't want to just give up. So Erwin, Raphael, McManus, thank you for bringing us this book. And we'll pick up where we left off in the next video. I love you. God bless.